The final paper. At Madison University, students were used to competition. The prestigious Ivy League campus boasted the brightest minds and the most demanding academic programs in the country. Among the cutthroat atmosphere of the psychology department, one professor stood above all others, Dr. Evelyn Marks. Marks had a reputation for pushing her students beyond their limits. Her upper-level abnormal psychology seminar was legendary, not only for its grueling workload, but also for the final paper, an original research project that determined half of the students' grade. It was rumored that no one had ever received a perfect score. One particular fall semester, 5 students were handpicked for Dr. Mark's seminar, each of them brilliant in their own right. Lucas, a star athlete with a double major in psychology and neuroscience. Grace, a shy but intellectually driven student with a photographic memory. Ethan, the charismatic leader of the campus psychology club. Maya, an outspoken advocate for mental health awareness. And Claire, whose quiet demeanor hid a mind sharp enough to dissect any psychological theory. What none of them knew was that this semester something much darker awaited them. The semester started normally with Dr. Marks delivering intense lectures on personality disorders, schizophrenia, and psychopathy. Her voice carried an air of authority, her piercing eyes scanning the room as if searching for weakness. Despite the challenge, the 5 students worked tirelessly to impress her. Halfway through the semester, Dr. Marks announced the final paper assignment. The topic? The psychological roots of violence. Each student was to present an original case study based on a real-life subject and provide an in-depth analysis of the psychological factors that led to violent behavior. The task was daunting, but Lucas, Grace, Ethan, Maya, and Claire took it in stride. They knew the importance of this paper, not just for their grades, but for their futures. But as they dove deeper into their research, strange things started happening. It began with Lucas. He had chosen to study the case of a local inmate who had committed a series of brutal assaults. As he spent more time visiting the prison, reviewing psychological evaluations, and interviewing the man, his demeanor began to change. His friends noticed his increasing agitation, his tendency to withdraw during group discussions. Then, one day, Lucas simply disappeared. He stopped attending classes, stopped responding to messages. His professors assumed he had burned out, but his friends felt something more sinister was at play. "I saw him at the library the night before he vanished," Claire said to the group one afternoon. "He looked terrified." "Maybe he got in too deep," Ethan suggested, his usual bravado tinged with concern. "Sometimes these cases can mess with your head." But Grace wasn't convinced. "Lucas wasn't the type to back down," she said. "Something's wrong." As the group continued their work, Luke's disappearance cast a shadow over them. Maya, who had been studying childhood trauma in violent offenders, began having nightmares about her subject. Ethan became obsessed with the charismatic serial killer he was researching, spending hours rewatching interviews and reading case files until his cheerful personality gave way to a more dark, more brooding demeanor. Grace, always the rational one, started noticing small inconsistencies in the data she was gathering. It was as if her subject, a man convicted of arson and murder, had pieces of his life scrubbed from existence. The more she tried to dig deeper, the more obstacles she encountered. Records that were sealed without explanation, interviews that fell through last minute, and files that suddenly went missing. And then there was Claire. She had chosen the most abstract case of all, studying the psychological profile of an unidentified killer known only as the Mask, responsible for a string of unsolved murders in the city decades ago. The case was cold, but Claire was drawn to it. She spent hours sifting through old police reports and psychological assessments, trying to find a connection no one else had noticed. But as Claire grew more invested, she started receiving strange messages, anonymous emails containing cryptic phrases, disturbing images, and locations she didn't recognize. At first, she ignored them, assuming they were some twisted prank, but then one message stood out. You're closer than you think. By the end of the semester, only 3 students remained in the seminar. Lucas was still missing, and Maya had withdrawn after suffering what appeared to be a mental breakdown. Her research had spiraled into obsession, and she became convinced that her subject was still stalking her from prison. Ethan, Grace, and Claire met frequently, sharing their mounting frustrations and fears about Dr. Mark's increasingly cold demeanor. They couldn't shake the feeling that something about the entire class was wrong. Has anyone noticed how Dr. Marks doesn't seem concerned about Lucas or Maya? Ethan asked one night as they sat in the common room. She probably thinks it's survival of the fittest, Grace muttered. She always says psychology is about breaking down the human mind. Claire, more withdrawn than ever, looked up from her laptop. I think she's watching us. The others stared at her, confused. What do you mean? Grace asked. Claire turned the screen toward them, revealing an encrypted file she had managed to hack from Dr. Mark's personal records. This is about us. She's been documenting our every move. What we say, what we study, how we react to the pressure. We're not just writing about psychology. We're the subjects. Ethan leaned forward, reading the file over Claire's shoulder. This can't be real. She's using us to prove her theories. It's like some kind of twisted experiment. Then we need to confront her, Grace said, her voice shaking, before anyone else gets hurt. The 3 students decided to confront Dr. Marks after class the next day. As they entered her office, they were greeted by the sight of Dr. Marks sitting calmly behind her desk, as if she had been expecting them. Ah, she said with a thin smile. I wondered when you'd figure it out. Ethan stepped forward. You know what you're doing. You're using us for some sick experiment. Dr. Marks' smile widened. You misunderstand, Ethan. You chose to take this class. I simply guided you. The psychological roots of violence are fascinating, don't you think? Claire's eyes narrowed. Lucas is gone. Maya's in the hospital. You did this to them. Dr. Marks stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. No, Claire, they did it to themselves. I merely opened the door to the darkness in their minds. Some couldn't handle it. Others could. You're insane, Grace spat. Am I? Dr. Marks replied, her voice smooth. Or am I just more willing to see the truth? Fear, obsession, it's all a part of the human condition. The mind is a fragile thing, easily broken, if you know where to push. Ethan lunged toward her, but Dr. Marks stepped aside with ease. You won't find Lucas, she said coldly. He's part of something greater now. As for the rest of you, I suppose we'll see who survives this semester. In the days that followed, everything changed. Dr. Marks vanished, her office emptied overnight. The university claimed she had taken a sabbatical, but the remaining students knew better. Grace dropped out of the class, too traumatized to continue. Ethan, driven by anger, launched his own investigation into Dr. Marks, determined to expose her for what she was. But it was Claire who made the most disturbing discovery. Late one night, she was combing through the files she had taken from Dr. Marks' computer when she found something horrifying, a journal entry from a week before. Claire shows promise. Her detachment is admirable. She's ready for the final stage. The words chilled her to the bone. She was part of this from the beginning. She hadn't been a victim. She had been groomed for something worse. As she closed her laptop, her phone buzzed. It was a new email from an anonymous sender. "Are you ready to take over, Professor Marks?"